Mass shootings in America. At least a dozen people are dead, 38 are injured, and police believe attacks in Chattanooga and Philadelphia show signs of multiple shooters. Meanwhile, lawmakers are negotiating some form of gun control. A bipartisan group of senators are trying to get a draft deal by the end of the week. We have the latest on Capitol Hill on those efforts and more. And after several months of investigation and closed-door meetings, the House Select Committee investigating the deadly January 6th insurrection is on the verge of holding its first public hearings. Our Robert Costa gives us a preview of what to expect. Plus, one of the most consequential decisions in front of the Supreme Court in a generation is set to be ruled on. The latest on the challenge to legalized abortion in America. But we begin with gun violence and its continued impact nationwide after more than a dozen people were shot and killed over this weekend. Congress could be ready to possibly vote on new legislation this week, although it remains to be seen if any new measures will ultimately make it to the president's desk. Meanwhile, more than 200 Texas conservatives and self-described gun enthusiasts are demanding action on firearm safety. An open letter published in the Dallas Morning News supports raising the Texas gun purchasing age to 21 and calls for expanded background checks. Serena Marshall has the latest from the White House.
It is enough.
Amid an outbreak of deadly mass shootings over the weekend, the district attorney of Philadelphia is calling for change.
Any legislator who is not willing to put the lives of innocent bystanders, of women and children and young adults above their political future belongs out of office.
Demands for federal gun control legislation continue to grow, including from the White House, where President Biden has been pushing for universal background checks, federal red flag laws, and an assault weapons ban, or at least raising the age to purchase one to 21. A new CBS News poll shows a majority of Americans also support those provisions.
We have structurally problems when you have large disconnects between what voters say they want and what happens in the U.S. Congress.
The House could pass a broad gun reform package that contains the president's wish list as soon as this week, but is unlikely to make it through the evenly divided Senate.
A bipartisan group of senators has expressed optimism negotiating towards a more narrow bill, which also could include mental health and school safety provisions.
Those core components, I hope, will be part of a package that we can get 60 votes to pass.
In the meantime, some Democratic-led states are taking their own action.
We're raising the age of semi-automatic weapons so no 18-year-old can walk in on their birthday and walk out with an AR-15.
Monday, New York's governor signed a package of gun reform bills into law. Serena Marshall, CBS News, the White House.
For more, let's bring in Democratic Virginia Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, who represents the Commonwealth's 7th District, which includes, among other things, Henrico County. The Congresswoman is also a former CIA case officer who worked on counterterrorism cases. Ms. Spanberger, thank you for joining us. We see you this week as the U.S. House is poised to pass this sweeping, overarching gun bill. It bans high-capacity magazines, bump stocks. It raises the age to purchase some semi-automatics. But you've been urging fellow Democrats to break it up into individual bills. Why so?
That's right. Well, and I think importantly, one of the premises on which we have kind of founded this idea is this package that Congress is proposing is comprised of 8 different bills. 8 different bills that do different things. Safe storage related legislation, changes to magazine capacity and what's permissible for magazine capacity, a ban on large capacity magazines, importantly, raising the age at which one can purchase an assault style rifle, right? Various different pieces of legislation. They do different things. They focus on different parts of the problem, and they respond to different needs. And our goal as legislators should be to send bills over to the Senate with the maximum possible amount of support. And what we know is that these different components of the bill, and certainly it was mentioned even in that letter, that open letter from Texas Republicans, that they were talking about a potential support for raising the age limit. So there's a place where even we see it within constituencies in Texas voicing their opinions in support of raises in the age limit. Why not have that bill get its own standalone vote so we can see just how much support exists for that bill? How much support exists for banning straw purchases? How much support exists for the other elements, the 8 elements that are part of this larger proposed package? Now, to be very clear, everyone who signed on to our letter requesting that these bills be brought separately, in our letter stated our intention to vote for every single one of them. But I want to vote for them individually, as do my counterparts who signed on to this letter. Let's vote bill after bill after bill. We want to demonstrate through our votes our support for these individual components. And we also want to recognize that in order to send a bill to the president's desk, which should be every legislator's final goal, we have to demonstrate that it can get support across a broader coalition. The numbers within the United States Senate demand it. And so by voting on each of these bills individually, we could demonstrate through votes which bills have the most support and a possible trajectory to get on President Biden's desk.
We're showing some of our new CBS News polling numbers, which, among other things, Congresswoman, shows a majority of Americans supporting some new restrictions on assault weapons. So what do you make of what the Senate group is discussing, a much more incremental, smaller in scope set of changes, including increasing the availability of states to get money for red flag laws? Would that be sufficient in your district?
Well, certainly, I think what's important is that we take action and we send a bill to the president's desk. And certainly the suite of bills that I would vote for and the suite of bills I would like to send to the president's desk may not be what we ultimately are able to send to the president's desk. But when we talk about each of these proposals individually, so let's talk about red flag laws, extreme risk protective orders. What we know is that in states where extreme risk protective orders are in place, that gives law enforcement officers a tool to use when there are reports from friends or family members that someone might be in crisis. And certainly what we know is that Florida and the Republican state legislature and the Republican governor signed red flag laws into place because before the Parkland massacre, people reported that would-be murderer to law enforcement. They had deep concerns about him and his intentions. Law enforcement went out, federal and local, went out and spoke to him, but there was no action they could take absent the existence of gun violence restraining orders, absent the existence of extreme risk protective orders. So Florida took this step forward knowing that the data show that when extreme risk protective order laws are in place, the numbers of people who do harm to themselves, suicide by firearms, go down. The number of people who are able to murder or shoot their loved one, oftentimes a domestic partner, in time of crisis go down. And the number of law enforcement who are responding to crises where there are guns involved go down. And that's an issue of officer safety. It's also an issue of, keeping our community safe. And certainly within the circumstance that we saw within Parkland, people were worried about that man. They reported him to law enforcement. At the time, law enforcement could take no steps forward. So being able to show the support for extreme risk protective order legislation in the House, certainly in the Senate, if we were to pass that legislation, that is a step forward. Now, it's not everything that we need to do and should do, but it's one of them. And that is what I am looking at. That is how I view this. All of these things that we could do, if we're looking at raising the age at which one can buy an assault-style rifle, we know that the murderer in Uvalde, Texas, and the murderer in Buffalo bought those assault-style rifles shortly after their 18th birthday. Raising that age to 21, which is the age at which one can purchase a handgun, creating parity there, would have had a major impact, at least in those two horrific circumstances. So the steps forward I want to see are making common sense changes to ensure that we can really, truly get at the heart of some of the weaknesses within our laws. Notably also talking about large capacity magazines. We know that when there are limits on magazine capacity, the number of fatalities go down. When there have been shootings where large capacity magazines are utilized, it's a more than 60% increase in fatality.
Have you gotten some indication from the House leaders or a response from them they might be willing to break this up into a magazines bill, an assault weapons purchase bill, or have they not responded yet?
So certainly there's tremendous support for breaking up. And again, it's actually just voting on the bills as bills. So it's not necessarily breaking them up. It's choosing not to lump them all together. And so voting on them one by one. I have yet to find a member of Congress, with the exception of one or two decision makers, who isn't in support of voting on them one by one and who isn't opposed to actually lumping them together in a package.
But the decision makers are keeping this in one package at this point.
As of right now, we're continuing to say they're individual bills. They do different things. Let's vote on them one by one and set them up for their maximum success by demonstrating the maximum support that each of these individual provisions can get. Because we know that once they're put together, for somebody who might be willing to vote for raising the age, but opposed to, let's say, large capacity magazine bans, now that person who would have come to the table, who would have voted in support of one of those pieces of legislation, is now voting against effectively both of them. So from a pragmatic standpoint, if our goal is to get bills to the president's desk, taking these bills as individuals rather than clumping them together is the optimal strategy that many members of Congress are advocating for.
Let's shift gears for one final question, ma'am. Obviously, the January 6th committee has its first primetime revelatory hearing Thursday night. Do you think there are people with open minds who are persuadable by what they show?
So I do hope that there are people who read about January 6th, who certainly saw the early days of the reports of it on the 6th, on the few days that followed, and then got on with their lives and haven't been tuned into all of the ins and outs of what happened, what led to it. The purpose of this committee is to explain exactly that. What led to that day, who was involved, what happened that day. And frankly, there's a lot of information related to what led to that day and what happened that day that just hasn't yet been made, either made public or made public in such a way that it's available for kind of mass consumption for people who are busy with their jobs and busy with their kids and busy with the challenges that we continue to face as Americans. So I do think that there will be information that will be presented in a succinct and direct manner that will be new to many Americans as they tune in or as they read the reports of what occurred in the days after the first hearing.
From the 7th District of Virginia, Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
For more on gun control and the day's top political stories, we welcome in Nancy Cordes and Caitlin Huey-Burns. Nancy is CBS News chief White House correspondent, and Caitlin is a CBS News political correspondent. Before we dive in, Texas Republican Senator John Cornyn just took to the Senate floor and discussed the Senate's bipartisan talks on gun reform, maybe giving us some clues of what may or may not be in that bill. So let's take a listen.
If we reach an agreement, law-abiding gun owners will not be impacted at all. Our conversations are ongoing, and indeed, all 100 senators will be part of that conversation. But these are the broad parameters of the things that I'm interested in addressing. We're not talking about banning a category of weapons across the board, a ban for certain high-capacity magazines, or changing the background check system by adding additional disqualifying items.
Sounds like a whole bunch of red lines, but confirmation that the talks are ongoing. So, Caitlin, at this point, where do these gun control talks stand?
That's right, Scott. And Cornyn was sure to say that, look, don't expect any legislation this week. He urged Chuck Schumer to let these negotiators have about another week to work out some kind of plan that they believe could get 60 votes in the Senate and actually make it to the president's desk. But you're right. He was laying out some red lines there and trying to show kind of how narrow this framework would be if and when they get to it. Interestingly enough, there was a group of Republican mega donors in Texas who came out with an ad in the newspaper this morning, and it was essentially trying to give Cornyn some political cover here. They were urging Cornyn and this bipartisan group to come up with some gun measures, and they said they supported him in that effort. They wanted to issue red flag laws. They wanted to raise the minimum age for buying a firearm to 21. That's something that's off the table, but these red flag laws are really kind of centerpiece to the Senate negotiations at this point. Cornyn was also pointing to this bill that he sponsored with Senator Murphy a few years ago that was signed into law that basically fixes the criminal background check system, closes some loopholes. And he suggested that that was something of a roadmap for negotiators here. And that's interesting because that was, fixing a current system, not necessarily expanding background checks. And that's what he was saying on the floor today, that they're not looking at a big sweeping bill, and they're not looking at some kind of big expansion of background checks or other items, but kind of a more narrow focus. Murphy, however, has said that the talks are going quite well. He sounded very optimistic over the weekend in interviews, saying that this is the furthest essentially that they've gotten since he's been involved in these conversations. So both sides are urging the leader to give them the time to negotiate, to get something that could actually pass this chamber. But in order to pass this chamber, it's going to be a pretty narrow bill.
The other Republican senator we've been watching on this issue for so long is Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. He co-sponsored that background check legislation years ago with Joe Manchin. He was on Face the Nation Sunday, seemed to have some strong words to the president on gun control.
Problem is, I think the president might have been a president who would reach across the aisle, try to bring people together, but he's chosen not to take that approach since day one. He has sided with the far left of his party and really not reached out to Republicans.
Nancy, how's the White House reacting to that?
Well, they're saying that the president's Office of Legislative Affairs, with all due respect to Senator Toomey, has been in constant contact with these negotiators as they work through a compromise, and that the president himself wants to give the negotiators room to work and doesn't believe that getting directly involved and talking with all of them right now would be particularly helpful. Beyond that, the president reaching across the aisle on an issue like gun safety, until now it hasn't appeared that that would bear much fruit because there's this massive gulf between Democrats and Republicans, and there's never been a hint that there's much middle ground there. Yes, Senator Toomey was able to hammer out a deal with his Democratic counterpart Joe Manchin a few years ago, but the problem was he couldn't get enough Republicans on board to support it. So how President Biden would be able to do that if a Republican like Pat Toomey couldn't do it, that's really an open question.
In the meantime, another crisis, the gas prices hitting their historic highs almost on a daily basis. You're now at $4.78 a gallon. That's 25 cents more than just a few weeks ago. It's 60 cents more from a month ago, and it's climbing towards $2 more than last year's average. Just a remarkable escalation here. Democrats are pushing back on the president's reportedly meeting with the Saudi crown prince about energy prices. What's the White House saying about this?
Well, the White House is not confirming that the president actually is going to meet with the Saudi crown prince. There had been talk of President Biden possibly making a quick trip to Saudi Arabia when he heads to Europe for some meetings later this month. That's now off. But the White House press secretary said today it is not confirmed that he'll go and meet with the Saudis next month. And partly that's because the president has been taking some heat for even being willing to entertain a meeting with the Saudi crown prince. Even Adam Schiff, a Democrat, was on Face the Nation this weekend saying that he doesn't think that the White House should go anywhere near the Saudis. He says that the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, has blood on his hands for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and he himself wouldn't shake his hand or have anything to do with the Saudis. And so the White House House clearly taking some heat over this, but the White House press secretary today, Karine Jean-Pierre, arguing that if it is in the interest of Americans for the president to go over there, perhaps talk gas prices, perhaps convince the Saudis to produce more oil, then he may very well do it. Take a listen to what she had to say.
As the president said on Friday, he believes it's his job to try to bring peace where he can. This trip to Israel and Saudi Arabia, when it comes, would be in the context of significant deliverables for the American people in the Middle East region. We look forward to consulting closely with members of Congress, but again, I don't have a trip right now to announce. So there's really, I don't want to get ahead of something that we just don't have anything to share.
She was, however, pummeled with questions today, Scott, about some mixed messages coming from the White House. Why is it that President Biden is now potentially open to meeting with Saudi dictators when at the same time he is hosting the Summit of the Americas this week in Los Angeles and denying the leaders of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua the right to attend because they themselves are dictators? Is he willing to meet with dictators or not? That's the question this White House is getting.
Caitlin, I want to shift to an issue you've been covering, but also dealing with, the baby formula shortage. A few shipments of formula have come in from abroad, but the question is that making the situation any better?
Yeah, well, our pediatrician actually gave us a couple of cans of formula at our appointment last week, so that's helpful. But when you look at the shelves, they're still not to where they should be, and especially it's in areas that don't have the kind of access that we have here in cities or low-income areas. And there are two parts of this problem that are persistent. One, of course, is the supply chain issue, and the response to that has been the administration, as you mentioned, flying shipments from overseas. They just announced a fifth Operation Fly Formula to take place June 9th to have 1.6 million bottles of 8-ounce bottles of formula shipped here from Germany to try to ease the supply chain issue. But there's also the question of that closed plant in Sturgis, Michigan, that really helped to cause all of this. That plant reopened a couple of days ago, but there are a lot of questions that lawmakers have about the reopening of that plant. Rosa DeLauro, whose committee oversees the FDA, raised a lot of questions earlier today in a press release saying that there are still a lot of questions about how this plant was open. She has a lot of questions for the FDA about the protocols in place for reopening this plant and argues that they haven't been made as transparent as they could have been. And so even though this plant is reopening, it still will be a few weeks until that production actually hits shelves. But these questions about how this happened in the first place, not only with the supply chain issue, but also with this plant, where you've seen directly cause a lot of this, there are so many questions left for the FDA about how to prevent this from happening again, and has also raised a lot of data points, quite frankly, about how this industry, what the oversight over this industry is. So this is something that will linger beyond this immediate crisis.
And meanwhile, the anxiety and the fear for a lot of parents remains as these questions remain. Nancy, the U.S. and South Korea held these joint military drills recently, something they've done for years, but something's different about this year's exercise.
That's right. What's different about this year's exercise is that it involved a U.S. aircraft carrier for the first time since 2017. The exercises also lasted for 3 days. So some flexing of military muscle on the part of the U.S. and South Korea just at a time when North Korea has been signaling its willingness to test another nuclear weapon. And this is kind of the U.S. and South Korea making good on a promise that they made a few weeks ago when the president was in Seoul, where he stood there next to the leader of South Korea and said that, if North Korea is going to continue to make these threats, if it's going to continue to openly work on a nuclear weapon, that the U.S. and South Korea are going to step up their military exercises in the region. And now that's exactly what's happening.
Nancy Cordes, Caitlin Huey-Burns, a busy start to a busy week. Thank you both.
You're welcome.
Lawmakers are looking toward red flag laws as a possible bipartisan move to address the rising number of mass shootings across the country. And a new CBS News review shows how effective such laws have been to date and where they're coming up short. Plus, the House Select Committee investigating January 6th is on the verge of public hearings. My colleague Robert Costa has been speaking to committee members about what they're hoping for and how they're preparing for this primetime programming. You're streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow.
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, there hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's gonna bounce back.
It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We got it. We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before. That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News.
What's your message to consumers?
They need help now.
Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel. Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail. We experience the weather in a whole new way.
The January 6th House Select Committee is set to hold its first public hearing Thursday. Their findings are set to be presented as a recent NBC News poll shows a decreasing number of Americans see former President Trump as solely or mainly responsible for inciting the attack, just 45%, while 55% believe he is only somewhat or not really responsible. Meantime, on Monday afternoon, the Justice Department announced charges of seditious conspiracy for Enrique Tarrio and 4 other members of the Proud Boys for their roles in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. For more, let's bring in CBS News Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa. Joins us from Capitol Hill. So, Bob, what more can you tell us about these charges, these new charges against Tarrio and the Proud Boys and the timing of all this?
Scott, great to be with you. There's no one who has covered the Proud Boys more at CBS News than you. And what we have seen from this group over the years is a group of far-right organizers who have now become front and center in the January 6 investigations. And I say plural for a reason. The House committee, which begins its next phase of public hearings this week, has certainly focused on the Proud Boys to some extent in its own probe. But the perhaps more intriguing probe at this time is the ongoing Justice Department grand jury investigation, which continues to cast a wide net over the events of January 6 and the weeks leading up to it. And they are not afraid, it appears, based on these indictments, of going after the charge of sedition, which is a highly unusual charge, to say the least.
And we note in the new superseding indictment there are some unnamed people, which means there are more shoes to drop as the charging documents keep rolling in. You spoke with Congresswoman Liz Cheney about former President Trump's involvement in the January 6th attack. Let me play some of that exchange. It was a great interview.
We are not in a situation where former President Trump has expressed any sense of remorse about what happened. We are, in fact, in a situation where he continues to use even more extreme language, frankly, than the language that caused the attack. And so people must pay attention.
What else did the Congresswoman say about the former president?
She said that the Republican Party, in her view, remains a cult of personality around former President Donald Trump. And that is a conclusion she has reached as vice chair of this committee going on months now. And it is said as someone who 90% of the time during the Trump presidency voted with President Trump. This is a conservative member of Congress when it comes to policy. But when it comes to the question of democracy and the peaceful transfer of power in the matters around January 6th, Congresswoman Cheney has fully broken with the Republican leadership, with the former president, and she believes that they stay with him, in part because of fear of his political capital. But she added, when I pressed about this, that she believes House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is operating in part due to political calculation. She called it craven, that he believes the Speaker's gavel is within his reach as long as he stays close to former President Trump, and that's why he's doing so.
What a historic falling out between two former colleagues in Republican House leadership. According to your reporting, Bob, what role will the Department of Justice and the judiciary play in the investigation moving forward?
The committee will ultimately decide, after it's done this phase of public hearings, whether to issue a criminal referral. It was interesting that Congresswoman Cheney did say in the affirmative that she believed what happened on January 6th and the events leading up to it were a, quote, conspiracy. I pressed her on that point, whether it merits a criminal conspiracy referral of defrauding the American people and trying to obstruct an act of Congress, the certification of an election, remains to be seen. The committee has not revealed its hand on exactly how it's going to play its recommendation, if any, to the Justice Department. But what is clear is this committee wants to lay out many facets of evidence, from depositions to videos to images, that paint a portrait of what the Congresswoman believes and others was a conspiracy to overturn an election.
So the committee is putting on a primetime show Thursday. That's a big responsibility. It's a big undertaking. What else can you tell us about the preparations they're making?
In some ways, it's a show, but it has to be more than that for this committee to have the impact it wants. This is not a television episode, even though it will be aired on prime time. This is American democracy. A peaceful transfer of power was disrupted. Can they go beyond reminding people of the horror and violence of that day and bring in a new acknowledgement to the American people of the legal and political crusade that was behind the scenes happening alongside the operations on the ground that led to the violence and the attack itself? But what about the efforts to object to the election, to overturn the election, to try to have Vice President Pence walk away from the lectern, to try to push the election into the House? All of these facets of January 6th were playing out from the Trump White House, often spearheaded by President Trump himself. And the committee's challenge at this point is bringing people's attention to those issues, to those fronts, as much as they bring a spotlight onto the issues of the violence and images and videos we have not seen on that part of the investigation.
Good work, Robert Costa. We look forward to having your reporting as part of the coverage Thursday night, 8 p.m. Eastern. Bob, thanks for the time.
Appreciate it.
Senate negotiators are focusing on implementing red flag laws as a way to possibly keep firearms out of the hands of people who show signs of mental instability. Under red flag laws, courts can order guns taken from anyone ruled to be a possible threat. 19 states and the District of Columbia already have such laws, and a number of other states are now looking to follow suit. But a CBS News review finds some states are struggling to implement these laws, which are already on the books. One of those states is Illinois. There, we found just a few dozen emergency gun seizures have occurred in the past year, despite a series of mass shootings. CBS News found far more, hundreds each year, in less populated states like Maryland and New Jersey. Illinois state legislators say some of the failure in implementing the law is due to a lack of awareness about it.
implementation is critical to saving lives. And this is a tool that people need to know that they have at their disposal. And if you don't use it, if it's underutilized, it's a big problem because we won't be able to prevent those gun tragedies.
According to our CBS News review, red flag laws rarely get used in communities like New York City or Washington, D.C., where stricter gun laws are already in effect. The Supreme Court is poised to rule on more than 24 cases which stand to reshape laws across the nation. But a potential overturning of the federally protected right to abortion is the one taking center stage. How a number of states are already preparing in case that happens. Plus, some 7 states are on the verge of Tuesday primaries, how long-term incumbents are facing uphill battles to hold their seats, and how recent redistricting is forcing some candidates to fight their own allies. You're streaming CBS News.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before. That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News.
What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. Here's a look at some of our top stories. At least a dozen people have died and 38 have been injured following a weekend of deadly mass shootings. Police say the gunmen involved in the Philadelphia and Chattanooga attacks were not working alone. Meanwhile, a bipartisan group of senators hopes to have a draft deal on gun control legislation by the end of the week. The proposal is expected to address red flag laws, school safety policies, and mental health resources. And the January 6th House Select Committee set to hold its first public hearing Thursday. The panel's findings will be presented days after charges were announced against prominent Proud Boys members for their role in the insurrection. 7 states are holding primary elections Tuesday to set the stage for U.S. House and U.S. Senate races this fall. In Mississippi, Republican Congressman Stephen Palazzo is facing his largest ever field of challengers. If none of the 7 candidates in the race wins a majority of the votes, a runoff election will be held later this month. Meanwhile, in Montana, a second House seat has been added to account for that state's growing population. And the former Interior Secretary under President Trump is in an open race for that new seat. But critics are pointing to multiple ethics investigations centered on his business dealings. Races will also be held this week in California, Iowa, New Jersey, New Mexico, and South Dakota. The Supreme Court is expected to hand down more than 24 decisions this month on a series of cases which have the potential to reshape laws that have been in effect for more than a generation. At the same time, the court is continuing its investigation into last month's leak of a draft decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. The court's final decision on abortion could come any day. CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford joins us now with more on this. Hey, Jan, has anything happened since that leaked draft ruling overturning legal federal abortion rights to indicate what's going to come next?
Well, no. I mean, what's happening inside the court right now is the investigation is ongoing. The court doesn't know who the leaker is. We don't know who the leaker is. And they're continuing to try to get their opinions out. There's a lot of work to do in these last, month to 2 months of any term. And so this has been a huge distraction for the court, the justices, the clerks, obviously. They still have 30 decisions left and, 3 or 4 weeks to get there. So there's just a lot of work to do. That's what's going on inside the court right now. But on that opinion, the draft, of course, was that 5 justices were poised to overturn Roe versus Wade, the landmark decision that guarantees a woman has a constitutional right to an abortion. There's no indication that that lineup of 5 justices has wavered, which means that if it does in fact hold, when the final decision comes down, of course, Roe versus Wade, the 1973 case, would be overturned. The states would then be free to set their own policies on abortion.
Just remains seismic, the potential impact of this shift and this ruling. How are some of the states trying to prepare for this?
You know, I think seismic is a good word. And when we saw the draft leak, it came as a shock to a lot of people that the court actually could do this. Now, remember, they were close back in 1992, 1 vote short. So there's been a kind of a campaign over the years from some of the abortion opponents to get to this moment where we are today. What we've seen in response is states, you've seen some of the liberal states try to pass laws that would guarantee abortion access there. And you see the conservative leaning states passing laws that would restrict abortion access once this decision comes down. Now, more than a dozen states already have those laws on the books, or so-called trigger laws, that would take effect if and when the court ever were to overturn Roe versus Wade. But then you see still other states passing additional restrictions and laws. So we're now looking about potentially 20 states that would have more restrictions on abortion than Roe versus Wade would allow, including a number that would ban it completely.
And then there are those other 30 or so outstanding cases. I know there's a big one coming out of New York State. What are the most notable to you?
You know, I got to say, first off, though, in any term, this case, the case on abortion would overshadow anything, and it wouldn't matter what the other cases were, really. So that's kind of the term we're talking about. But you're right. I mean, there are a number of other cases that in a regular year we would be talking about right now. And the gun rights case out of New York is one of them. It involves a law that's been on the books since 1911. It puts more restrictions on your ability to get a concealed carry permit than most of the other states require. In New York, you have to show you have basically some kind of special need for it and have good moral character. The question is whether that infringes on your Second Amendment rights to own a gun. At argument, the justices seem to suggest that that went a little too far, which would make it easier to get one of those permits to carry guns outside your home in New York. Now, whether or not that's going to hold or not, we don't know. It's hard to predict off oral arguments, but it looks like the court is going to be more protective of those Second Amendment rights. Now, of course, this also comes at a time when gun control, gun laws, that's under increasing scrutiny after the tragedies we saw in Buffalo and in Texas and other places across the country. People point out, however, that this law involving concealed carry permits wouldn't capture some of those kind of incidents we're seeing in the mass shootings because people aren't getting concealed carry permits when they're looking to conduct some of those mass shootings that we're now seeing across the country.
After that draft opinion was released, Jan, we saw 2 things. We saw protests outside justices' homes, and then we saw Congress do something it rarely does, move swiftly to pass extra protection for the court system, for the judges and their families. Have there been any other incidents?
They're under increased security because the threats continue and the threats are real. It's a real concern for the court, for the Supreme Court police officers as they try to ensure that these justices remain safe. You've seen protests, of course, not only at their homes, at the court. The court has now got a fencing completely around the building, streets closed around the building. And the threats are continuing to come into the Supreme Court. It's a concern, and they're taking that very seriously. And you're right. I mean, Congress also responding rapidly and seriously.
Jan Crawford, we're in the home stretch, but it's a busy, intense home stretch. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Officials say the man who murdered a retired judge in Wisconsin allegedly had a hit list of prominent politicians, including Michigan's governor and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. Judge John Romer was found dead in his new Lisbon home Friday. The suspect was found in the judge's basement with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He's in the hospital in critical condition. Wisconsin's attorney general said the shooting was a, quote, targeted act based on some sort of court case. Governor Whitmer's deputy chief of staff in Michigan said her office had been notified about the list, but declined to give details about the suspect. Lethal injections will carry on in Oklahoma after a federal judge ruled that the state's 3-drug method there is constitutional. Injections were halted when attorneys representing prisoners there claimed one of the cocktail's drugs failed to make inmates unable to feel pain. The state is now free to request execution dates for the dozens of inmates on death row in the state. Attorneys for the prisoners are considering appealing the ruling. After a weeks-long lull, Russia is once again firing rockets on Ukraine's capital city. The new figures show Ukraine's military is losing soldiers at a higher rate than the U.S. did in Vietnam, and what the State Department is saying about continued dialogue with the Kremlin. You're streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow.
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, there hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's going to bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me?
We got it.
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before. That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News.
What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador says despite an invite from President Biden, he won't be attending the Summit of Americas. He says it's because other regional countries were not invited. White House officials have confirmed that Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela were not invited to the summit, which began Monday. They say the countries were excluded over human rights concerns and a, quote, lack of democratic space. The Mexican president says his country's foreign minister will attend the meetings in his place. The leaders of Bolivia, Guatemala, and Honduras have also pulled out of the summit over the invitation list. Russia is ramping up attacks on Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, as troops on both sides fight for control of a key city in the country's eastern Donbass region. Chris Livesay has more from Odessa, Ukraine.
A building burst into flames. Russia claims it struck tanks inside, donated from Ukrainian allies. But Leonid, a local resident, says there's nothing in there but rail cars. It's a repair shop, not a military factory, he says. Vladimir Putin is determined to show he can still strike whenever and wherever he wants by air, far from the battlefields of eastern Ukraine, which have crept into Olena Holovka's front yard. We lived peacefully, she says. Now we have nothing left. The war has never been bloodier. Ukraine says it's losing between 60 and 100 troops per day, roughly twice the number of American soldiers lost daily at the height of the Vietnam War. Russia now occupies 20% of Ukrainian territory, says Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who visited the embattled Donbass region far from the capital of Kyiv. In this deadly struggle of tug-of-war, Ukraine has recaptured territory in Severodonetsk and is intent on pushing Russian troops back to their border with the help of advanced long-range missile systems en route from the United States. Once they get here, Vladimir Putin is now vowing Russia will strike new targets in retaliation. But nothing has stopped him from pounding this country for more than 100 days, even turning hunger into a weapon. Russia has blockaded Ukraine's ports. Some 20 million tons of grain destined for the developing world now risk rotting on the docks. Chris Livesay, CBS News, Odessa, Ukraine.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has survived a vote in Parliament that could have removed him from power. The no-confidence vote came amidst multiple scandals for Johnson. Conservative lawmakers voted 211 to 148 in favor of him remaining as the nation's leader. The Prime Minister has faced criticism in recent months after revelations he threw parties violating COVID-19 restrictions. President Biden has temporarily lifted tariffs on solar panels made in Southeast Asia after an investigation froze imports and delayed construction projects. The Commerce Department has been investigating panels from Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam to see if they're circumventing tariffs on goods made in China. Mr. Biden has also invoked the Defense Production Act to boost solar panel production here at home. We're going to take a quick break, which means you have a couple of minutes to download the free CBS News app on all your devices. You can catch live local coverage from across the country from all of our CBS stations. And while you're at it, check out Paramount Plus. We've got a mountain of content for you to stream there as well, including your favorite shows, movies, and sports.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow.
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, their hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's gonna bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct. Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News.
What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
This week on 60 Minutes,
That's incredible.
The 60 Minutes.
60 Minutes, 60 Minutes.
Are you ready for some tough questions?
Let me ask you this.
You know how this sounds.
What's your response to that?
60 Minutes Sundays on CBS.
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Go to the ends of the earth
Right now.
We got something crazy.
and reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
We found it.
You're kidding me!
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
A handful of U.S. World War II veterans gathered in France Monday to mark the 78th anniversary of the D-Day invasion of Normandy. Ian Lee has more on their message for future generations.
Tanks are rolling once again through this small French town to honor the men who fought the Nazis 78 years ago. Just a handful of D-Day veterans returned, now in their 90s. Though their bodies are weak, their pride is just as strong.
I remember some good friends that are lost there. It's a little emotional then.
Back in 1944, an Allied armada floated off Normandy. As troops landed on the beach, metal filled the air. The details of that day are seared into the memory of Raymond Wallace, who was just 18 at the time.
When we started hearing that flak hitting the plane, we all got a little scared then.
The war may seem like a distant memory, but veteran Charles Shea sees similarities in Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Ukraine is a very sad situation. I feel sorry for the people there.
Shea says today's generation should never forget the lessons of his generation.
They should protect their freedom that they have now.
The greatest generation giving their greatest advice for a better future. Ian Lee, CBS News.
First Lady Jill Biden and the Postmaster General have unveiled a new postage stamp honoring former First Lady Nancy Reagan. The first class forever stamp officially goes into circulation today, which would have been Mrs. Reagan's 101st birthday. The art is based on Reagan's 1987 White House portrait. She's now the 6th First Lady to be featured on a U.S. postage stamp. That does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday to Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And a reminder, if you want to watch previous episodes of the program, you can see them anytime on the CBS News website. Just head to cbsnews.com/red and blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy.